Hi everyone, I'm Casey and this is my final presentation for GWTeach. So the final lesson plan that I did was changing up my third Teach lesson plan for a virtual synchronous lesson, and this would be for 7th grade science. The topic would be natural selection and evolution, and the objectives are students will explain how traits will become more prevalent in a population due to natural selection, and students will describe how environmental conditions determine what traits are selected for or against. And the general 5E overview of the lesson is we have the pre-test and the post-test on either end, and the main body of the lesson is in the exploration, the explanation, and the elaboration. For the exploration, I came up with this natural selection activity in beetles, where I came up with this species of beetles called the DC beetles, and this activity is to show how natural selection causes change in what traits are expressed in a population over time. And so this is like the original sampling of what the beetles look like. And then as changes happen in the environment to things like urbanization, it impacts which of the beetles are going to survive and reproduce, causing this change in the final population to the original population. And so students will break off into breakout rooms and go through this on Google Slides by like copying and pasting the beetles based on whether they will survive or not, and then they can have this clear snapshot of the original population of beetles and in the end, the like end population of beetles and compare and contrast them. And then that will lead us into the explanation. The explanation is going to be like student-led first, taking from their understandings from the activity. And then it will transition from that and their ways of understanding and the words that they use to talk about the processes to me really just bringing in the vocab words and trying to connect their understandings to these vocab words. And some of these things are like natural selection, survival of the fittest, how environment plays a role in what traits are going to be advantageous, and then Lamarck versus Darwin. And with the Lamarck versus Darwin, it's going to be talking about what each of them believed and then like polling the class and asking them who they believe is correct. And then after this explanation, we want to utilize the vocab words. So we're going to do this natural selection activity in humans about lactose tolerance, where we would have this activity and then a word bank full of the vocab words for the lesson. And then after that, after they test their own understanding, they're going to watch a video by Hank Green on lactose tolerance and how that evolved in humans. So because this is a virtual synchronous lesson, we have to keep in mind the SAMR model. And so the DC beetle activity, I believe, is modification. I tried to model it after the Big Dig activity that we did in class because I think that was very effective at utilizing technology in a way that we could do in person, but would be less effective and more confusing. I think having I've seen this natural selection activity with like M&Ms. I think you could do it in person with M&Ms, but having like 30 or 40 M&Ms of different colors out on the table and then having them choose which ones are going to make it can be really confusing, and you also don't get that clear snapshot of the population at the beginning, at the end, and how it changes from step to step. It's more about the process, so I think with this way they get the process and they get to see the individual snapshots in a way that is really effective. And then my other uses of technology are just using the worksheet that for the elaboration about lactose tolerance, where they would just make a copy of it for themselves and add in their own answers and fill in the blanks. And this is just augmentation or substitution, because that's something they could do in a regular classroom by just making a handout. It's not modifying the activity, but I think that is okay and still effective. And then talking more about augmentation and substitution, a lot of the teaching strategies I think are just teaching strategies that we do already in in-person classrooms that are effective, but I think they're more effective even in virtual classrooms in order to keep student engagement. Because I know in virtual classrooms, I find it much easier to just zone out and stare at a window and not feel engaged when there's not that eye contact and not the person in the room talking to you to keep me there. So here are some things to keep the students engaged. We have utilizing student responses in the explanation, and that's very important because I know that if I say something in class and the teacher comes back to it, they'll usually look at you and then all of a sudden you're like, oh, I have to pay attention in case I'm called on. There's checking in on the students' understandings by looking through the slides. So this is just like the teacher circulating through the room except in a virtual sense. And that's during the DC beetle activity. And then the third one is asking students if they need more time by having them raise their virtual hand instead of their physical hand in the classroom. And then these last two I think are especially important in order to keep students paying attention. I tend to participate less in online classrooms because I don't feel, like I said, that direct contact. So I think asking students if they have any questions and nobody responds, then the teacher should take that and ask a question to the class and have them respond in the chat or however they want to respond in order to keep engagement. Because otherwise, if you are not prompted to, I think it's really, really easy to zone out in online classrooms. And then this is also true for the MVP instructions. Because they're on their computers, they can click on other websites and things. So I think it's very important to have clear instructions and explain an activity fully and then direct the students to go begin the activity. And that has to do with just really good instructions and MVP instructions. And then next we have the major changes of the activity. So that the DC Beetle activity, the exploration, is a huge change because originally we had this activity where you had species of organisms like rabbits or wolves, and then we would put them in a new environment like the Arctic or underwater and looking at how they would likely evolve in these environments and how the environments would select traits to be advantageous. And I think this activity just didn't get through to the kids in the way that I wanted it to. I think a lot of them began to understand evolution as something that happens to an individual organism because we just had like a picture of a single rabbit. And so then they were just like, oh, this rabbit, if it doesn't adapt by gaining thick fur and like having white fur because it's in the Arctic, is going to die. And then the rabbits will go extinct. Instead of seeing like the change over time and how it's all about the whole population of the rabbits and how it's not about a single individual. And I think the activity that I designed also with keeping the modification in mind is a cool activity to do that. And then the next big change is the elaboration activity. We previously didn't have the lactose persistent worksheet before the video. We just had them watch the video, but I think it's really important for them to tackle their own understanding and see if they can interpret the concepts and the new vocab that we've just learned before just having someone do it before them. It's about them actively engaging with the material instead of just passively having it fed to them via like the teacher's lecturing or a video. Because I think a video is just essentially another part of a lecture. And I think that brings us to the next point where it's repeated use of vocabulary. A lot of the students I noticed in the post-assessment did not get full points. They got developing instead of has it because they weren't utilizing the vocab and they weren't talking about natural selection. They would talk about it's about individuals that are like most fit are going to survive and reproduce. But it's really important to acknowledge that it's most fit for their environment because adaptations are subjective to certain areas. And then the last example that we have is adapting to a virtual synchronous landscape. And this is a major change because it's just doing the little changes like having them raise their virtual hand or having them type something in the chat or having them physically log off at the end of class. Just all those little changes to the script and the functioning of the class and making sure that you share your screen with audio so that they can see the video. Just all those little things that it's important to keep in mind that we just have to go through and edit the lesson plan. And then last step, I want to talk about growth. I think my confidence to act upon my ideas for teaching has grown a lot. In the beginning, I had a really hard time coming up with a lesson plan and to being able to take an idea and make a lesson plan with different activities. My first lesson plan was just like generally one activity that I carried out throughout all the 5 E's. And then, especially in the first lesson plan too, I had a hard time responding to the kids' questions. The kids asked a lot of really cool questions and they were very engaged because we were talking about asexual reproduction and we were talking about that in terms of cloning. And so they were like, oh, our starfish is regenerating cloning or our twins cloning. And I think those are really cool questions that I didn't know the answer to, and so I froze up. And I think it's okay to not know the answer and just take those questions and then generally throw them back to the class or relate them to what you're talking about. And even if you don't know the answer, being able to relate them to the things that you're talking about and use them as examples of things to further student understanding and connect it to their real lives or the things that they are thinking about is really important. And that actually brings me to my beliefs, where I think student engagement is the most important thing, and I've even been noticing this in my own classrooms since taking this class, especially this semester. Like, the classes in which the teachers are having students do work outside of class or in class to try to explain things themselves instead of just lecturing for 75 minutes, I have come away with a lot more understanding and an ability to have confidence in my ideas and act upon them. I think in college, there's the expectation that you're going to be lectured at, and then outside of classes where you apply the material, and I guess that's okay, but I think especially for grade school students, it's important to have them be understanding and then also applying it through the 5E model in the classroom, because that is how I really connect with the material, and I think my best experiences this semester have been connecting with material outside of class, because I get so little of that actual working through it myself in class. And yeah, that is everything. Thank you so much for a great semester, and have a lovely summer.